modeling, it can mean a whole variety of things, and we are going to break that down today. But first of all, I'm going to hand it over to my co-host. How are you doing today, Helen?
I'm good. It's been a long week, so I'm sort of looking forward to just chilling out for a bit and doing this.
Yeah, it is kind of nice. This is our first time kind of on a weekend recording, so yeah. It's very nice. We're a bit well rested, and our brains are, well, I think mine's functioning, but yeah. So, 3D models. 3D modeling.
3D models, 3D modeling.
Assets in some places.
So 3D modeling is a term that kind of gets used very vaguely, even though it can also be a very specific term. So the layperson will generally say 3D model when they're looking at, say, a 3D character or a 3D environment or a prop or a vehicle that is completely digital. And often within that is wrapped in not only the model itself, but the textures, the way that it actually looks on the surface, the colors, the patterns, the way it reacts under light, as well as any hair or fur it might have on it, the way that it is rigged up so that it can move. All sorts of things like that. So there's a whole host of different sort of sub-disciplines that are included within 3D modeling, of which one of them is modeling.
What's also interesting is then some of the softwares you probably have heard of as well that do 3D modeling, and that will be things like Blender, Cinema 4D, and of course the granddaddy is Maya, and I guess 3D Studio Max as well. But I'm not opening that can of worms of that debate. But that is kind of the softwares you will hear. Helen is smiling because
that is quite a can of worms.
But
because I actually learnt 3ds Max first.
Yeah.
And was very, very distressed when I started picking up Maya, because despite the fact that they are, both Autodesk products, one of them is much harder than the other.
Yeah, I learned Maya, so if I did 3D Studio Max, I'd be like, what? Huh? So yeah, I'm trying to teach myself Cinema 4D, but I digress.
Yeah, I'm gonna have problems. I will always have this it's not even Maya's fault that I hate it. It's technically my university's fault for teaching us 3ds Max first. Because if I'd been taught Maya first, I feel like I would have had a great time with it. But because I was comparing it to 3ds Max all the time, which is like baby's first 3D studio modeling program. 3D modeling problem. That was a Freudian slip and a half. But yeah, so we've got a whole host of different tools that we can be using to do that. I went through this a little bit when we did our sort of intro to the VFX pipeline episode, where I talked about all the different disciplines and departments. And
I guess from as an editorial standpoint, I see them as disciplines because I have to select the discipline when we daily or when we're doing client naming. So I would say disciplines personally. So to kind of break down the different kind of 3D modeling aspects, so we've established that there's multiple tools that you can kind of do the same thing. There's just different levels and skill sets and things. But I think a lot of people, when they think 3D modeling, they're going to think your Pixar character animation and things. But what they also don't know is for even some simple shots, like say you need a gun to freeze and break in half, that in order to get that shot, you have to create almost kind of like a digital prop to be able to do that kind of thing.
Yeah, so frequently when things are being built for use in visual effects, they will be categorized down into characters, props, vehicles, and environments. Now, these can obviously all intersect a little bit. Like you might have a bear and a bear wearing a jacket, and that jacket might also be a prop because later on in the sequence he takes it off and throws it on the floor and sets it on fire. So the movies that I'm coming up with in my head for these examples are beautiful, incredible stuff. But so you might have a version of that character with the jacket, a version of the character without the jacket, and then a separate prop. So we can make all those different pieces so that we can use them in different ways. Also, environments can offer is a much bigger thing than anything else, really. Obviously, because they could encompass an entire continent. Looking at you, Lion King, with all of Africa, because someone decided building all of Africa was a good idea.
Yeah.
But within that, it's broken down into a couple of different ways, because an environment is not just, if I'm looking at, say, the office that I'm in right now, this is an environment, but I would not consider sort of the desk and the chair and the computer itself to be the environment. They are props within
Correct.
the environment. So I would perhaps have a separate team who might be building me props. They might be building me 2 or 3 books that I can duplicate into the whole bookshelf of 50 books. They would be building me tables and desks and chairs and computers and stuff so that I can populate the environment with those things. And it goes the same with all of Africa, right? You go, well, we need some trees, we need some grass, we need some bushes, some rocks. So you get people to make those. And then the people who work on the environments themselves often are populating those areas. They are set dressing the same way that they would in the real world.
Yep.
So it's all fairly... there are some analogs to making physical objects. It's kind of what I said when we did the pipeline episode about characters. I always use the description of a puppet. Like, if you can model it out of a solid piece of wood, and that's your 3D model, but in order to be able to do anything with it, you need to split that up into sections that you can then join up and animate together, and that's your rigging. You need to paint it, and that'll be your textures. So there's a lot of little individual parts that go together there. Vehicles and props are probably the 2 most simple things. Props often only need to have a rig that means that it can be moved around in a scene, which is nice and easy. Or they could have something a bit more complex, like if you had a beanbag that needed to be able to squash and stretch around as it gets moved around. Like, maybe you might want to have a little bit more control over that one. And vehicles, you can have something that's as simple as a solid car if you're going to have it from miles and miles away and you don't need to see any details. Or you can have things that have, rotating wheels. You can have really detailed ones that have all the suspension included so that you can have them bouncing up and down as they go down a road.
Looking at you Batmobile.
You can have all the individual pieces inside that car for when you need to blow it up and you need to see all the bits of the engine. So there's a lot of different ways that you can approach your models, and a lot of different ways, levels of detail that you can work with them at. So there's a whole sort of host of different talents, of different skill sets that are being used here. And the other thing that I haven't even talked about is Groom, which is obviously something fairly close to my heart, having just come off Lion King with all those big furry animals. But Groom is actually one of those crazy visual effects disciplines that is so much of a blend between an art and a science, because there's an awful lot of technical know-how with how the tools themselves work, especially when you have different plugins that you can be using. There's obviously stuff that's built into Maya, but then there are external plugins that can be used. I think there's one called Shave and a Haircut that you can install. There's all different VFX studios have got their own proprietary stuff that they use. So there's a lot of sort of understanding the tools there, but then at the same time, it's looking at an image of a lion's mane and working out just the right value to put in there to make that hair scraggle exactly as much as you need it to.
Yeah.
How much clumping is needed in order to make this look realistic, and it's some truly astonishing work that gets done by the groom artists on these shows.
And this is also kind of where you'll see that sometimes some of these disciplines start to blur, because I could be wrong, but I feel that's where it goes into simulation as well.
Absolutely.
But we won't obviously touch on simulation, but this is where you can kind of see it's almost that's the point where it's kind of passing the baton, or these things are happening in tandem to where they're getting the simulation, but then the model is still being built. And then it blows my mind, how do they get those simulations on the model, on the rigging? Like, yeah, I just sit there in editorial and go, that looks amazing, that's cool. And I love seeing like the turntables, because the other thing, I guess for a lack of a better term, I will call them assets or props or whatever. I know not every facility may use that term, but I just love seeing the assets, because it's just a turntable showing this is what your tree looks like, this is what your digidouble is going to look like, and it's amazing to kind of see it. Some of my favorites were the turntables where you had the digidouble and then you had the real person on set, or like the way they did like the full 360, and just to see how close they get the digital double.
Yeah, one of my favorite sessions I've ever been with a client is showing them a digidouble and them telling us, no, you've got it the wrong way around. That one's the real person, that one's the digidouble. And we were like, no,
we had
no, it's actually not.
No,
we've just got a really good digidouble here.
Well, I was on something very recently that it was for a certain animal. And what they did was to trick. They made the digital animal, they had someone act out like they were a trainer, but there was not actually an animal on set. But then they made the animal look like it was reacting to this trainer. And it completely fooled the client. They were like, wait, that's not actually on set. And I was like, that is so brilliant. And then obviously kind of the animator character people were like, well, I can tell you the tells on how it's not an actual, but it was just cool to see and clever to also show that integration.
It's a really smart way of doing it. I think there was obviously this is not a real thing. We're talking about visual effects, nothing's real. But on Detective Pikachu, when they were doing the promo videos for that, there was a lot of they did like short little vignettes of the Pokemon where perhaps you might scan an animal or a digidouble, and they had them like standing in those places and like just doing little idle things, and it was just a very cute way of showing off all the Pokemon that were going to be in the movie, sort of using an environment that people are kind of familiar with, like people who watch TV shows will have seen behind the scenes things of a person with that big white screen that goes up behind them, so that do you know what I mean? There's a lot of sort of really cute ways of doing things, and I think using those is really smart.
So I think that kind of covers the kind of the modeling 3D basics of it. If anyone's interested in going into more detail about rigging, aka it's kind of the skeleton of the model, we can definitely do a deeper dive on another episode for that.
Yeah, because there's a whole bunch of different techniques and different but because rigging is I would say probably one of the more technical things that I would say rigging and effects are probably the two most technically demanding disciplines in visual effects and lighting. They're probably there's an awful lot more sort of jargon to explain with rigging.
Yes.
So yeah, it's some really interesting stuff, and I know some ridiculously talented people, but I think might be an entire episode on its own.
Yeah, so we will definitely leave that for another time. So one of the things we could kind of dive into, one thing that's kind of happened over like the last 9 years is something called, that everyone probably now knows of, 3D printing. And what I find fascinating, when I was learning Maya, they were just starting to have like a project file or something that you could then send to somewhere for them to 3D print. And it's amazing to me now, almost some 9 years later, I have friends who are like into like the cosplay scene and things like that have 3D printers in their house and they're just printing away at home. And I just wanted to kind of jump into that because that does go kind of hand in hand with the whole 3D modeling aspect.
Yeah, it's really fascinating stuff, to be honest, and it's one of those, as with a lot of things I think in visual effects, sort of tangentially related. I feel like there's an awful lot of different parts of the VFX industry and the VFX pipeline and all the different methods and tools that people use that can kind of go off in a completely different way. And I think one of the really cool things about 3D printing is prosthetics, in the way that they can make not only exactly the thing that you need, so they can take a scan of whatever it is that they need to be matching. They can adjust the 3D file and then print it so that it will sit up exactly snugly against where a limb needs to be, or something like that. And then they can also make the structures so delicate and so fine. They can have moving parts that work together. Because I think when it first sort of started coming to prominence, it was very much, here is this solid piece of plastic that we've 3D printed. And even when I was at university, I remember them having a 3D printer and looking at it and just going, this seems like a really good idea that hasn't fully come to fruition yet. And it's only really in the past maybe, 5 years, 6 years, that it's really started to become that impressive, like that. It's always been impressive, but maybe that useful and that applicable to a whole host of different things. There are, when you're just saying about cosplay, I have seen booths that you can get into and they will scan a whole body and then print a tiny 3D replica of you. And I've seen them do that at cosplay conventions as well. So you can have a 3D print of yourself dressed as your favorite character that you've made using maybe 3D printing. It just becomes this crazy cyclical nightmare. But the tools that people are using, obviously it's not necessarily the same things with Maya and 3ds Max. Quite often for these very complex mechanical things, it's stuff like AutoCAD, which is another tool by Autodesk because they apparently own the world. But they the same principle applies, right? Obviously you don't necessarily need to have quite as much focus on texturing as you would in visual effects industry, but it's the same thing where you have a 3D model made of various surfaces or very small planes that connect together to create a physical object, digital physical object. And then obviously the actual 3D printing process is an additive situation where they put down each little layer of plastic of where it needs to go, and they build it up layer upon layer. And it's, to be honest, it's really fascinating to watch, and it'd be cool if we could maybe link to one of the
we'll definitely
one of the videos of those laying them out.
Yeah, absolutely, because I've never really seen it. I've seen it briefly, or I saw it actually the other day in Big Hero 6, which is hilarious because that's an animated film, but it was that kind of concept. It's fascinating to see it go, because it's not a fast process. It's not like things, but you also mentioned something that was also kind of coming out when I was just getting involved in kind of being like a visual effects support at a film school, was 3D scanning as well.
Yes. Which
it was fascinating. They had something that was like the size of a book at the school, and you could, if you wanted, you could get like a 180. In some places, obviously bigger places, you could get a whole 360 scanning, but what was fascinating was it would somehow also capture the lighting and the texturing as well.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's just incredible where technology has gone and how fast it's going.
Yeah, and it's a huge thing that's incredibly useful for building 3D models, right? So when you're saying about digidoubles, if you start off by just having pictures of a person you need to match to, there's only really so far you can go before you start really struggling or to be honest, with me right at the beginning, you start struggling to get all the planes of the face in the right place, because even just like getting the angle of a cheekbone wrong can just make someone look completely different. And one of the cool things about these scanning companies that have these tools, it's called LiDAR. I cannot remember what it stands for, but it's sort of basically you shoot lasers at things, and then whatever bounces back, it works out the distance between them, and there you go, it's worked out where the environment or the object is that it's scanning. And there's a couple of companies that sort of service the visual effects industry. There's things like Gentle Giant or Industrial Pixel. They will often have a booth on set, and once you've got actors who are in full costume, you can get them in, you can scan them, and that means that the teams who are building digital replicas of them have got an incredible starting point. And I can kind of imagine that people might either think this is cheating, or they might go, oh, it's so easy, it just scans it for you and then you know it. These are kind of the same people who say things like, can't you just Photoshop it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And like completely useless comments like that. Because one of the fun things about LiDAR material is that what you actually want in visual effects is not necessarily exactly what is on set. Because people have got this little film of peach fuzz all over their faces and all over their bodies, and if you've got a hairy man, all over their arms and legs. And when you are modeling something, you kind of want to not be modeling that peach fuzz, so you need to be able to take it down to that layer of just skin.
Yeah.
So obviously the LiDAR systems are so precise and they have so much information in them that they will include that little layer of peach fuzz, which means that the scans often aren't exact, accurate replications of what you might see when you look at someone, because quite frequently you aren't really consciously, or you aren't really aware just because of lighting conditions, or I don't know how oily my face is, the peach fuzz that is on there. So you aren't necessarily you can't just import that in and go, okay, there he is, there's Superman, he's done now. So there's an awful lot of work that goes in after that with sort of matching all that to what the character should really look like. So there's a whole bunch of extra work that needs to go on there.
Well, the other thing is, too, it's definitely scanning like a reference image, but you can't animate that, because you can't then paint in, like, you know, when he moves his arm, the jacket is going to fold a certain way, because you don't have that information, because 9 times out of 10 they're in a T pose or like a 45 degree angle pose, so everything's straight, so you can see all aspects. It's not like you can get that scan and then slap it on a model and then go, okay, it's rigged and animated, go. It's just, it's not that simple at all.
Absolutely. Actually, I want to see if I can find some other videos to link to, because one of the big things, especially with faces, is the way that faces deform in order for them to be able to be animated. So this is a combination of modeling, of rigging, of the Blend Shapes team, who also do some crazy work. And Blend Shapes is kind of a weird little in-betweeny thing. It is sculpting for example, we'll take a face. Sculpting a face into a multitude of different poses, which you can then blend between. So you can say, at 100%, my eyebrows are raised to the peak of where they will be raised to, and at 0, they will be back down to neutral. And an animator can use a slider to get between those two exact,
points,
those two pinnacles.
Yes.
Those two extremes.
And it's interesting, this was used quite a bit in the Dark Crystal, because with the augmentations of the puppets, to get those subtle face animations, a puppet on set is done with hands kind of thing. But yeah, they were able to do this to add
it's just mouth flaps, right?
Pretty much. So they were able to add that little nuance. But that, if you want to hear more about that, was covered in our previous episode of animation.
Exactly. So in order to animate a face, you need to have all these additional controls. So for example, these eyebrows going up and down, that can both be a slider that will go between neutral eyebrows and raised eyebrows, but you could also have a rigging control that you can pull the eyebrows around with. So there's a whole host of different tools that get given to the animators by these teams who create the assets and create these models. So it's a pretty intense part of the process. And I think it's quite often fairly undervalued just because it's not fully explained to a lot of people.
Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, in this process, again, the term I'm using, assets or whatever, is being done the minute a show starts, correct?
Yeah, absolutely, because you can't do any work without... well, obviously there's some work you can do without 3D assets, but if you have any shot that includes... I need to replace Superman with a digital Superman so that I can make him fly away, then you need to have that digital asset available so that you can start working with it. It's a lot of really early work that goes into these shots. Yeah.
So taking the role of kind of the listener/viewer of this episode, I can just hear myself saying, so hey, if you build, say, chair A, B, and D for this film, and then you need it for another film, and things like that, is it safe to say that a library is built and then it makes things even faster because you can grab those and populate them in something new? Or is it a case by case where you're just like, no, everything has to be built by scratch? And that's why it is such a essential part of the beginning of the VFX pipeline and getting a film out the door.
Yeah, so this is actually something that's a huge part of making games with kit bashing, which is basically taking a whole bunch of assets that you've used before and taking elements of them and mixing them together. So you might have a flower in a plant pot, but you actually want to put that flower on a character's head, and you can take that flower and move it onto that character's head and start working from there. So you don't have to remake that flower from scratch. It's the sort of thing that happens with these environments as well, right? You're making, say, 30 rocks that you put into a library that then you can populate the entirety of Africa. God, I hope they didn't just use 30 rocks. But say you spread out those, you change the colors, you change the size of them, you change the orientation of them, and suddenly you've got 500 rocks that all look different from each other, even though they're from the same 30 base objects. And this is sort of a really good way of being economical with the things that you're building. It's the same with sort of digidoubles. If I want to have a person, like I want to have a crowd of 30 people, then I could make one person or one man and one woman, and then I could just change the colours of their tops and the colours of their skin and the colours of their hair. And now I have a crowd of 30 people from 2 people. Where the only thing I've had to change was the color maps. So a lot of this is just kind of boils down to being really economical with the work that you're doing, because quite often we have crazy huge projects to work on and really tiny time frames. So we do need to be as smart as possible with them.
Sweet. Well, that pretty much sums up our episode. A bit of a shorter one, but it's, short but concise kind of thing about kind of the 3D modeling pipeline. So, Helen, where can they find us?
You can find us on Twitter @PendingFinal, on Facebook, Pending Final, on Instagram at Pending Final Podcast, or you can email us at pendingfinal@gmail.com.
And we're also, for the video watchers and everything, we are also on YouTube at the moment. We're looking to get up to about 100 subscribers, because then we can get a custom URL. So, but thank you for checking us out, and we will see you guys next time.
Thank you. Bye.